Ah yes, the Vikings. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the distant roar of their longships cutting through the waves, the smell of salt in the air, and the sense of something inevitable, something darker coming to the shores of Britain. But, as with most things in history, nothing is ever as it seems at first. No one, not even the most experienced sailors of the time, truly understood what was about to unfold when the first Viking ships made landfall on the shores of Britain. It was the year 793, a year like many others, though this one would be marked forever in the annals of history. The winds that day were fierce, the sea restless, and the monks at Lindisfarne, an island off the northeastern coast, were going about their prayers, unaware that their world would soon be shattered. But the storm that was coming wasn't one of nature, it was one of men. Viking raiders, hardened by years of harsh winters and unpredictable seas, had finally set their sights on this quiet religious world. They were driven not by the desire for gold, as some would think, but by something much deeper, a longing for a world untouched by their own. And so, with the first clash of swords and the echo of burning wood in the air, began an age of upheaval, of bloodshed, and of change. But how did it begin? What could possibly have made the Viking raids on Britain so intense and enduring? The answer lies not just in the rise of the Vikings as warriors, but in a time when Britain itself was divided and vulnerable. As we journey through this tale, we will walk the shores where these events took place, feel the wind that stirred the sails of Viking ships, and hear the cries of the first victims of the raids. We will witness the burning of monasteries, the rise of warriors, and the fall of kingdoms. But most importantly, we will understand the forces at play, the men behind the axes, and the lasting effects of their action. So I ask you, my friend, as we begin this story, what drove the Vikings from their icy shores? Was it the promise of riches, or was it something more? And how would Britain, a land already soaked in its own struggles, face this storm? The answers, I assure you, will unfold slowly, just as history always does. Let's see where this journey takes us, shall we? Ah, the first whispers of Viking raiders across the shores of Britain. Picture the scene. The air heavy with salt from the sea, the wind sharp and cold, the gray sky looming like a heavy blanket. It's the late 8th century, and Britain, with its coastal villages and bustling monasteries, is far from prepared for what's about to happen. This is the beginning of a new era, an age of unrelenting raids that would reshape the British Isles forever. Imagine you're standing on the cliffs of Northumbria, looking out over the restless sea. In the distance, a dark shadow appears on the horizon, slowly taking form. A longship, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the waves like a predator stalking its prey. The Vikings, fierce and relentless, have come. They've sailed for hundreds of miles from the icy shores of Scandinavia, driven by the promise of riches and the thrill of conquest. Their ships, sleek and fast, are designed to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who sees them approaching. The first recorded raid took place in 793, when the Vikings set their sights on the sacred monastery at Lindisfarne. To those living in the quiet, devout community, the sight of those longships must have been nothing short of apocalyptic. Lindisfarne was a place of peace, a center of learning and prayer. Its monks were dedicated to their faith, and yet in a moment all of that was shattered. The Vikings came like a storm, their swords and axes flashing in the dim light of dawn, their war cries echoing across the island. They were not just invaders, they were harbingers of destruction, of a new order coming to the land. The monastery at Lindisfarne, with its golden treasures and holy relics, was an irresistible target. As the Vikings stormed the shores, they wasted no time. They burned the buildings to the ground, looted the treasures, and took what they could carry. The monks, caught off guard, were left helpless. Some were killed, others taken as slaves, and all that had been a symbol of faith and learning was now reduced to ashes. The sound of the fire crackling in the air, the clash of metal on metal, and the terrified cries of the monks It was a scene of chaos and devastation. But it wasn't just the monastery that was affected. This was a message, loud and clear to the rest of Britain. The Vikings had arrived, and they weren't interested in peaceful coexistence. They had come for wealth, for land, and for power. Their raids would continue, growing bolder and more brutal with each passing year. And as the years rolled on, they would carve out a kingdom in Britain, one that would change the course of history. The question, of course, is why? Why did these Norsemen, known for their seafaring prowess and warrior culture, turn their attention to the British Isles? Was it simply the lure of riches, or was there something more? Perhaps it was the growing instability in Scandinavia, a land of harsh winters and scarce resources. Or maybe it was the allure of the Christian monasteries, so rich in treasure, so vulnerable to attack. Whatever the reasons, it was clear that these early Viking raids were only the beginning. They would become a wave crashing against the shores of Britain, leaving destruction in their wake. But what would the people of Britain do in response? How would the kings and the monasteries, so accustomed to peace, prepare for the coming storm? As we ponder this, think about the monasteries that would soon become targets, the communities that would have to adapt to this new and terrifying reality. What would they do to defend themselves, to hold on to their way of life? Could they withstand the Viking onslaught, or would they be swept away like Lindisfarne? The story of these first Viking raids is a turning point, a prelude to a much larger saga. And as we turn the page, we'll see how the raiders' reach expanded, how the kingdoms of Britain struggled to fend them off, and how a new chapter in the island's history was about to be written. What will come next? Let's find out together. In the quiet of the early morning, when the fog still clung to the coastline like a forgotten dream, something unimaginable was about to unfold. The year was 793, and the peaceful island of Lindisfarne, with its rolling green hills and sacred monastery, was about to be shattered by the thunderous arrival of men from the north, Vikings, whose name would come to strike fear into the hearts of many for centuries to come. Lindisfarne, a small island off the coast of Northumbria, was a place of great reverence. Its monastery, one of the oldest and most prestigious in all of Britain, was a sanctuary of learning and piety. The monks there had dedicated their lives to God, transcribing sacred texts, praying for the souls of the living and the dead, and tending to their simple yet devoted lives. It was a place untouched by the wars and chaos of the outside world, a peaceful island in the midst of an ocean. But in the distance, a storm was brewing, a storm that would not be made of rain or wind, but of steel and fire. As dawn broke that fateful day, the first signs of the Viking ships appeared on the horizon. At first they were just shadows, small dots in the distance, too far to be seen clearly, yet too close to be ignored. The wind carried the salty scent of the sea, and the waves whispered of an incoming threat. The longships, low in the water and cutting through the waves with deadly precision, were made for speed and stealth. Their dragon-headed prows seemed to pierce the sky itself, as though they were heralding a dark omen, a sign of things to come. The monks, so accustomed to the rhythm of their daily prayers, had no idea what awaited them. The sound of their chants echoed across the island, blending with the crash of the waves against the rocks. It was a peaceful, almost serene moment, as the light of the early morning bathed the stone walls of the monastery in a soft, golden glow. But that moment would not last. As the Vikings drew closer, the unmistakable sound of their war cries reached the ears of the monks. It was a sound they had never heard before. Loud, guttural, filled with bloodlust and fury. The Vikings landed swiftly, their ships grounding on the shore with a soft thud, and in an instant they were upon the unsuspecting monks. The first wave of raiders surged onto the land like a tidal wave. Their armor glinted in the dim light, and their eyes were wild with hunger, not just for food, but for riches, for power, for anything that could feed their insatiable need to conquer. The monks, caught completely off guard, were no match for the ferocity of the invaders. They tried to flee, but their slow, worn bodies could not outrun the lightning-fast warriors, who hunted them down without mercy. The monastery was torn apart. The air was thick with the sound of clashing swords and screams. The rich treasures of Lindisfarne, gold, silver, and sacred relics were plundered without hesitation. The holy altar, once a symbol of peace and devotion, was desecrated, its treasures taken, and its walls burned. The smoke curled up into the sky, thick and black, as though the very heavens wept for what was happening below. In those moments, the once sacred island was transformed into a battleground, a place of chaos where no mercy was given. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that was so devastating. Lindisfarne was a symbol, a beacon of Christianity and learning in the British Isles. Its fall was more than just the loss of a place. It was the loss of a way of life, a brutal reminder that the world was changing, that the Viking raiders would not stop at anything to claim what they wanted. The monks who survived were taken as slaves or left to wander the land, their faith shattered, their world turned upside down. Those who died were left behind, their bodies forgotten, their graves unmarked. The news of the attack spread quickly, carried by the winds, whispered in the halls of nearby kingdoms, and soon the entire Christian world knew. The attack on Lindisfarne was more than just an isolated raid. It was a declaration of war, a warning to anyone who might stand in the way of the Vikings' hunger for conquest. In the aftermath, a sense of unease settled over the island. The people of Britain had lived in relative peace for so long, unaware that such savagery was even possible. But now, with the burning ruins of Lindisfarne as a stark reminder, they realized the storm was coming. And as the dark ship sailed back into the mists of the sea, the question lingered in the air like a bitter wind. Would anyone be prepared for what was next? The fate of Lindisfarne was just the beginning. The Vikings had tasted the riches of Britain and they would return, but what would the kingdoms of Britain do? How would they defend themselves from such a relentless foe? The monastery's fall was just the first wave of a much larger storm, one that would leave its mark on the land for centuries to come. Would the people of Britain rise to meet it, or would they be swept away by the coming tide? It was a time of ambition, when the winds of change were blowing hard across the northern seas. The Vikings, those fierce seafaring warriors from Denmark, were not just raiders. They were conquerors, with a vision far beyond simple plunder. They were driven by a hunger for land, wealth, and power that seemed insatiable. Their goals in Britain were shaped not only by the promise of riches, but by the burning desire to carve out their own place in the world, to build an empire that would rival the mighty kingdoms of the day. In Denmark, life was harsh. The cold winds and long winters had shaped a people who knew how to survive against all odds. Yet survival alone was never enough for these men. From their long ships, they could see the vast fertile lands to the south. Britain, with its rich soil, abundant resources, and Christian settlements that seemed ripe for the taking. The Danish kings, ever ambitious, dreamed of more than just raiding. They wanted to conquer, to rule, and to establish a legacy that would echo through the ages. And so their eyes turned to the island that lay just across the sea. The Vikings' first goal was simple: wealth. Britain was a land full of riches, and the Vikings knew this. The monasteries, with their precious gold, silver, and holy relics, were particularly enticing. The Vikings, who were accustomed to the hardships of life in the north, saw these treasures as both a symbol of prosperity and a source of power. The rich kingdoms of Britain seemed to sit on a treasure chest, and the Vikings were determined to break it open. But it wasn't just the material wealth that beckoned them. It was the opportunity to gain favor and influence by controlling the wealthiest and most influential institutions of the time. These religious centers, filled with gold and manuscripts, became prime targets for the raiders, who saw their destruction as a way to weaken the Christian kingdoms and further their own cause. But there was something deeper behind the raids. Denmark was not a land of fertile soil, and its people had little access to the luxury of vast agricultural lands. The Vikings, led by kings like Ragnar Lothbrok and later his descendants, saw Britain as a place to settle, an opportunity to expand their influence, to create a lasting dynasty in a land that offered both abundance and strategic importance. They knew that Britain was fractured, with different kingdoms constantly fighting for power. This fragmentation created an opening, a chance to exploit the divisions between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. The Danes understood that Britain could be more than a place to raid, it could be a place to rule. And so they began to forge a plan. Their raids were not random or mindless, they were calculated. With each successful strike, the Vikings gained more territory, more allies, and more knowledge of the land they sought to conquer. It was clear that their goals went beyond mere pillaging. They wanted to take control, to secure a piece of Britain for themselves. The Vikings also had a particular goal in mind: to establish a foothold in the north of England, a region known as the Kingdom of Northumbria. Northumbria, though rich in resources, had long been divided and politically unstable. This made it an attractive target for the Danes, who could exploit the infighting between the Anglo-Saxon rulers. With the Kingdom of Northumbria weakened, the Vikings moved in, establishing a strong presence. They didn't just raid and leave. They stayed, settled, and made their homes in the lands they had conquered. They built fortified settlements such as the one in York, which would later become a powerful Viking stronghold. York was strategically located with access to trade routes, and its capture marked a significant step in the Vikings' quest for power in Britain. Yet the Vikings were not content with just the north. Their ambitions stretched further, southward to the rich lands of Wessex. Wessex, under the leadership of kings like Egbert and later Alfred the Great, was a formidable kingdom. It was here that the Vikings would face their greatest challenge. They would continue to press forward, pushing deeper into the heart of Britain. But what was the true driving force behind the Vikings' quest? Was it simply wealth? Or was there something more? Was it the lure of power and control? Or was there a deeper cultural and spiritual motivation? A desire to spread the Viking way of life? To assert their dominance over the Christian kingdoms that they saw as weak and decadent? Could the Vikings have ever truly been satisfied with just gold? Or was it their very way of life, their identity as warriors and conquerors, that drove them to take more and more? As the Vikings began to settle into the lands they had conquered, their ambitions seemed unstoppable. The question, however, remained: could Britain, with its mighty kingdoms, its strong leaders, and its fierce warriors, hold off this relentless tide of Viking ambition? Would the English kingdoms band together to resist the Danes, or would they crumble beneath the weight of Viking might? The answer to this question would not come easily, and it would not come soon. But one thing was clear: the Danes had set their sights on Britain, and they would not be easily deterred. As the years passed, the winds of fate continued to shift in favor of the Viking invaders, whose longships now frequently crept along the shores of Britain. What had begun as a series of brutal raids, striking fear into the hearts of the Anglo-Saxons, was gradually transforming into something much more enduring. The Vikings were no longer simply plundering. They were settling, claiming territory, and shaping a new reality for themselves in this foreign land. The establishment of the Danelaw was a turning point, a moment when the Vikings began to solidify their dominance and make their presence in Britain permanent. The concept of the Danelaw wasn't one born out of a single grand battle. It was the result of years of Viking incursions, small victories, and strategic alliances with the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Viking forces, led by figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Guthrum, had already begun to carve out strongholds along the eastern and northern coasts of Britain. They had been raiding for decades, but it was clear they were now looking for something more substantial than mere gold or livestock. They wanted land, resources, and control. And soon, they had their eyes set on a large swath of territory that stretched from the northeast to the southeast of Britain. By the late 9th century, the Vikings had already made significant inroads into England. They had first arrived in Northumbria, seizing York in 866, and from there, their influence spread like wildfire. The eastern kingdoms, including East Anglia and parts of Mercia, were now under Viking control. The decisive moment came in 878, when the Viking forces, led by Guthrum, clashed with the Anglo-Saxon army under King Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington. This battle would become a legendary moment in English history, a desperate confrontation between two worlds. The English, weary and battered, fought fiercely to protect their land, and against all odds they prevailed. Alfred's victory was a significant blow to the Viking invaders. It seemed as though the Anglo-Saxons might finally drive the Vikings back into the sea. But the Vikings were not so easily defeated. Guthrum, after his defeat at Edington, was forced to accept a peace treaty with King Alfred. It was this treaty that laid the foundations for the Danelaw, an agreement that would establish a Viking-controlled territory in eastern England. The Danelaw wasn't just a line on a map. It was a fundamental shift in the landscape of Britain. From the rivers to the hills, from the forests to the fields, a new power structure was rising. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were rulers. And their rule would last for many years. The Danelaw was not a monolithic empire ruled by a single Viking king. Rather, it was a patchwork of Viking-controlled territories, each governed by local Viking chieftains or kings, who answered to their larger, distant lords. These leaders, descendants of Norse warriors, established their own laws, customs, and social structures, which were markedly different from those of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Viking settlers brought with them their own ways of living, farmers, traders, and craftsmen who transformed the lands they occupied. They built new towns, established marketplaces, and began to cultivate the land in ways that the Anglo-Saxons had never seen before. Some of these Viking towns, like York and Lincoln, would grow to become thriving centers of trade and commerce, attracting people from all over the continent. But the establishment of the Danelaw wasn't just about settling the land, it was also about consolidating power and asserting dominance over the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For the Vikings, control over the Danelaw meant control over the wealth of Britain, especially its trade routes. The rivers that ran through the heart of the island were the lifeblood of commerce, and the Vikings knew that whoever controlled these rivers would control the kingdom. The city of York, strategically placed on the River Ouse, was particularly important. It became the heart of Viking power in the Danelaw, a place where Viking kings could rule, trade could flourish, and power could be asserted over the surrounding Anglo-Saxon territories. While the Vikings ruled the Danelaw, the Anglo-Saxons in the rest of Britain, chiefly in Wessex, were not idle. They watched, waiting and planning. The Danelaw, for all its strength, was not without its weaknesses. The different Viking territories often quarreled with one another, and there was always the threat of the Anglo-Saxons rising up to reclaim what they had lost. The Vikings were aware of this, and they were constantly looking over their shoulders, even as they expanded their influence. For all their victories, they could never fully relax. The Anglo-Saxons were a determined people, and in King Alfred, they had found a leader who would not let them be defeated. But for now, the Danelaw stood firm. The Vikings had achieved something that many believed was impossible, a foothold in the heart of Britain. Yet the question remained, how long could the Danelaw endure? Would it thrive, or would it eventually be swallowed up by the resurgent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? Was the rule of the Vikings in Britain simply another chapter in the long saga of conquerors coming and going? Or was it the beginning of a new era, one in which the Norsemen would become a permanent part of the English landscape? The answer to that question would not be clear for some time. But what was certain as the Vikings set about building their new kingdom was that Britain had been forever changed. The balance of power had shifted, and the world of the Anglo-Saxons would never be the same again. And so the story of the Danelaw continues. Its legacy still felt in the streets of York, in the names of towns and rivers, and in the bloodlines of those who came after. The year was 878. And the land of Wessex was teetering on the brink of despair. The Viking forces, under the leadership of Guthrum, had already swept through much of Britain. The mighty Danelaw, a vast region carved out by the invaders, had become the symbol of their dominance. Yet in Wessex, the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom not yet overrun by the Norsemen, a man named Alfred stood resolute. He was a king, yes, but more importantly, he was a beacon of hope, a symbol of defiance against a seemingly unstoppable force. King Alfred the Great, unlike many of his predecessors, understood that the Vikings were not mere raiders. They were warriors with strategy, intelligence, and a relentless drive to conquer. In the face of such an enemy, mere resistance would not be enough. Alfred's path would be one of both defense and preparation, knowing that victory could not be achieved without a deep understanding of his foes and a willingness to adapt. He began by strengthening his army, building fortified towns known as burhs, and devising a system of local militias. The Vikings had the advantage of mobility, but Alfred would use the landscape to his advantage, creating a network of strongholds that could be rapidly defended or reinforced. Alfred's first significant victory came after a series of devastating setbacks. In 878, he was cornered, forced to retreat into the marshes of Somerset, his army shattered, his kingdom on the verge of collapse. There, in the wet and treacherous land, he had no choice but to regroup. But Alfred, ever the strategist, would not give up. In a moment that would go down in legend, he took refuge in a small hut, hiding from the Viking forces that hunted him. It is said that during this time, a woman came to him, asking if he would watch a piece of bread bake. Distracted, Alfred famously said that it didn't matter how the bread baked. His kingdom was lost and nothing would change it. The story may be a bit of a myth, but it speaks volumes about the depth of his despair. But Alfred's despair was short-lived, for in the marshes, with the help of a few loyal men, he began to gather forces again. Over the course of the following weeks, more and more of his people rallied to his side. The Vikings, though numerous and powerful, did not know the land as well as the Anglo-Saxons. As the tides turned, Alfred's army grew, its morale lifted by the promise of their king's unwavering determination. Soon he was ready to take the fight to Guthrum and his warriors. The Battle of Edington, fought in the summer of 878, would prove to be the turning point. Alfred's army, bolstered by the support of local militias and his new network of burhs, met Guthrum's forces head-on. The battle was fierce, the clashing of swords and the cries of warriors echoing through the fields. The Vikings, though battle-hardened, were caught off guard by Alfred's tactical genius. Alfred had carefully chosen the ground for the battle, forcing Guthrum's forces to fight on uneven terrain where their mobility was hindered. The Anglo-Saxon warriors, though fewer in number, fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their hearts steeled by the knowledge that the fate of their kingdom rested on this one clash. In the end, it was a resounding victory for Alfred. Guthrum, leader of the Viking forces, was forced to surrender, but Alfred, ever the pragmatic king, knew that victory alone was not enough. Guthrum was baptized as a Christian, and a treaty was signed, solidifying peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. The Danelaw would remain, but Wessex would remain free. Alfred's victory was not just military, it was diplomatic. By offering peace and showing mercy, he ensured that the Vikings would remain an ever-present, though not dominant, part of British life. But Alfred's success didn't end with a single victory. His reign continued, and he embarked on a program of reforms that would strengthen his kingdom in the long run. He began to reorganize the military, ensuring that his soldiers were not only better equipped, but also better trained. He also began to build a system of schools and learning, understanding that the strength of a kingdom lay not just in its armies, but in its people. Alfred became a patron of the arts, promoting the translation of important works into Anglo-Saxon, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and passed down through the generations. He was not just a warrior king, he was a ruler who understood the long game. Alfred's impact on Britain would be felt for centuries to come. He laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England, a process that would take generations but would ultimately result in a stronger, more cohesive kingdom. His victories against the Vikings were not just about military conquest. They were about preserving a way of life, a culture, and a future. The Viking threat was far from over, but Alfred had shown that resistance, when backed by strategy, faith, and the strength of the people, could stand against even the most daunting of invaders. And yet, as we look back on Alfred's victories, we must ask ourselves, was this truly the end of the Viking threat in Britain? Could there be more battles to come, more challenges to face? The tides of history often turn in unexpected ways, and while Alfred's reign was a triumph, the story of the Viking invasions was far from finished. In the coming decades, what would become of the fragile peace Alfred had forged? Would the Vikings respect their oaths, or would they return to the shores of Britain with renewed fury? The answers to these questions lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. The year was 866, and a strange, unsettling breeze swept across the shores of Britain. The winds carried with them more than just the scent of salt and seaweed. They brought the sounds of a new, ominous kind of invader. The Vikings, known as fierce and relentless, were more than simple raiders. They came for much more than treasure and plunder. What they sought, in truth, was a fundamental reshaping of the landscape, not just in terms of land, but in the very foundation of British society. And as the years stretched on, it became clear that the Vikings' impact was far-reaching, not just in terms of bloodshed, but also in the economic life of Britain itself. The first Viking raids were quick, their goal being swift strikes on the coasts of Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. Yet what seemed like random violence was anything but. These raids, brutal as they were the harbingers of something much more structured, something that would fundamentally alter Britain's economy. For you see, the Vikings weren't just invaders in the traditional sense. They were traders, craftsmen, and in many ways, early entrepreneurs. Though they started by pillaging monasteries like Lindisfarne, taking gold, silver, and religious relics, they eventually sought to create a foothold, a place they could settle, trade, and even rule. The Vikings, unlike the Romans before them, did not merely conquer and leave, they stayed. They integrated into the societies they invaded, particularly in the northern and eastern parts of Britain. And as they did, they began to reshape the way people lived, worked, and exchanged goods. In the towns and villages of the Anglo-Saxons, trade was vital for survival, but trade during this time was often limited in scope. Local merchants trading amongst themselves. The Vikings, with their long-standing ties to Scandinavia, introduced new commodities, new routes, and new economic opportunities that would forever change the course of British history. One of the first signs of the economic impact of the Viking invasions was the expansion of trade networks. The Vikings, as skilled navigators, opened up new waterways for commerce, connecting Britain to the farthest corners of the North Sea, from Scandinavia to the heart of the Carolingian Empire. Through these networks, goods such as furs, timber, and iron were exchanged, along with more exotic imports including amber and spices. The bustling Viking settlements that dotted the British Isles, especially in places like York and Dublin, became hubs of commerce, where Anglo-Saxon merchants mingled with Viking traders, exchanging not just goods, but ideas. The trade of silver, in particular, became one of the driving forces in the economy of the Danelaw, the Viking-controlled territories of eastern England. But it wasn't just trade that the Vikings brought. With their presence came a new approach to taxation and coinage. In the areas under Viking control, the economy shifted toward more centralized forms of governance, in which kings and local rulers imposed taxes not just in land but in coin. In York, for instance, the Vikings established a mint to produce their own coinage, a clear indication of the growing economic importance of the region. These mints helped introduce a more standardized currency system to Britain, which would later play a critical role in unifying the English kingdoms under a common monetary system. The shift toward coinage also brought with it a broader shift in the economic landscape. It meant that wealth was now measured not just by land and livestock, but by the ability to trade and accumulate precious metals. This had a profound effect on Anglo-Saxon nobility, who now had to navigate a world where coinage had replaced the bartering systems of old. At the same time, the Vikings also introduced agricultural innovations to the areas they settled. They brought with them new farming techniques, including the use of horses for plowing and the introduction of more efficient tools for harvesting. These changes, though subtle at first, began to transform the agricultural landscape of Britain. The increased efficiency allowed for greater crop yields, and this in turn supported larger populations in Viking-controlled regions. The farming communities that grew around Viking settlements were often self-sustaining, But they also became important centers of trade, where the surplus of one area could be exchanged for the needs of another. Yet for all the economic progress the Vikings brought to Britain, their invasions also had a darker side. The initial raids brought widespread destruction, particularly to monasteries, churches, and towns, which were often the heart of local economies. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 was a prime example of the damage these invasions caused. In the short term, the plundering left many regions devastated, disrupting local economies and forcing communities to rebuild from scratch. But the longer-term effects were more complicated. The Danelaw, once established, brought with it a degree of stability, but the costs of war and the constant threat of Viking retribution also drained the resources of many kingdoms. In areas where the Vikings had settled, the local Anglo-Saxon economy had to adapt quickly, relying on the trade routes established by the invaders. As we look back on the Viking invasions, it's easy to focus solely on the violence and the battles, but the true impact of the Vikings on Britain's economy is far more profound. They brought new trade routes, new technology, and even a new way of thinking about currency and taxation. They helped shape the course of Britain's economic future in ways that would take centuries to fully unfold. And yet, even as their influence grew, questions lingered. How long would the Viking settlements last? Would the kingdoms of Britain ever fully recover from the ravages of war? Or had the Vikings permanently altered the trajectory of British society? These questions, like the tide of history itself, have yet to be fully answered, and the impact of the Vikings on Britain's economy is still felt, even today. In the wake of the Viking invasions, there was something far more profound occurring in the lands of Britain. The clash between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings was not just one of steel and blood. It was also a clash of cultures, traditions, and ways of life. But as often happens when two worlds collide, the result was not complete destruction, but rather a fusion. A blending of what had been different. This was no simple merging of peoples, but a complex transformation that affected every corner of life, from the way people farmed the land to how they spoke to one another. It wasn't long before the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings began to mingle in ways that would leave a lasting imprint on Britain. The Viking invaders, fierce warriors at first, started to settle into the very lands they had once raided. They were not just looking to conquer, they sought to integrate into the society they now called home. This wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a matter of opportunity. Over time, the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons began to share ideas, customs, and most importantly, their ways of living. In the Danelaw, the Viking-controlled regions of Britain, the blending of Anglo-Saxon and Viking cultures was most evident. While the invaders had initially brought destruction to the area, they also brought with them their own way of life, their own language, their own craftsmanship. Over the decades, these Viking settlers adapted to the land and began to establish families, intermarrying with the Anglo-Saxons. This wasn't just a merger of peoples, it was a merger of entire systems. Viking laws began to influence Anglo-Saxon society, and the shared experience of living under constant threat created a new hybrid culture that blended Viking resilience with Anglo-Saxon agriculture and governance. The most obvious change, however, was in the language. The Old Norse language of the Vikings began to merge with Old English, creating a linguistic fusion that would echo throughout history. Words from the Viking tongue began to seep into everyday speech, especially in the northern and eastern parts of England. Common words related to everyday life, such as window, from the Old Norse vindauga, meaning wind eye, or husband, from Old Norse husband, from Old Norse halfbund, from the Old Norse halfbund, from Old Norse hathbund, meaning master of the house, became staples of the English language. It was a slow process, but over generations the Viking influence on language would be undeniable. Yet language was only the tip of the iceberg. The Vikings also brought with them a rich tradition of craftsmanship, particularly in the areas of metalwork and shipbuilding. The Anglo-Saxons had long been skilled in these arts, but the Vikings introduced new techniques, particularly in shipbuilding. The longship, with its sleek design and ability to navigate both open sea and shallow rivers, revolutionized travel and trade in Britain. It wasn't just a tool of war, it was a symbol of Viking innovation. Over time, Anglo-Saxon craftsmen began to incorporate Viking methods into their own work, leading to a blending of styles that would define the era. But the changes weren't just material. As the Viking settlers began to establish their own communities within the Danelaw, they brought with them a different view of social structure. Viking society was not as hierarchical as the Anglo-Saxon one. While both cultures had kings and chieftains, the Vikings had a more fluid structure that emphasized local decision-making. This idea of local autonomy and decentralized power gradually found its way into Anglo-Saxon governance. In some areas, the Anglo-Saxons adopted Viking male assemblies known as things, where free men gathered to make decisions for their community. These gatherings, once a Viking tradition, began to influence Anglo-Saxon laws and customs, creating a more participatory form of governance. But perhaps the most striking change came in the realm of religion. The Anglo-Saxons had long been devout Christians, with monasteries and churches dotting the landscape. But the Vikings, though initially pagan, began to integrate into this Christian society as well. Many Viking settlers, after living alongside the Christian Anglo-Saxons for some time, converted to Christianity themselves. The process of conversion was not always smooth, and there were certainly moments of tension between the old gods and the new faith. But over time, the two belief systems began to coexist. Viking burial sites, once filled with pagan rituals and offerings, began to show Christian symbols as well. It was a subtle shift, but one that would deeply influence the religious landscape of Britain for centuries to come. Of course, it wasn't all peaceful. The Viking invasions had caused tremendous upheaval, and even in the midst of this cultural blending, old rivalries and tensions simmered just below the surface. The Anglo-Saxons, despite their eventual acceptance of many Viking customs, still remembered the early raids, the bloodshed, the destruction, and the fear. The Vikings, for their part, never truly forgot their warrior roots. There were always tensions between the two groups, with conflicts flaring up from time to time. But despite these differences, they continued to live side by side, shaping a new world together. As the centuries passed, the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Viking culture would come to define what we now recognize as English society. The two peoples, once bitter enemies, had created something new and powerful, a society that blended the best of both worlds. And yet, even as this new cultural identity began to take shape, questions remained. How would the next generation of Anglo-Saxons and Vikings live together? Would the tensions between them ever fully fade? Or would the lingering scars of the past continue to shape the future of Britain? One thing was certain: the fusion of these two cultures had set the stage for the England we know today. But it was only the beginning of a much larger story. What would become of this new society? Would it grow stronger, or would the old divisions resurface in new forms? The answers to these questions, like so much of history, would unfold over time, but the echoes of the Viking Anglo-Saxon fusion would never truly fade. As the Vikings began to settle into the lands they had once raided, something remarkable started to take shape. It wasn't just a series of temporary camps or hastily built fortifications. No, the Viking settlements in the northern and eastern parts of England were far more enduring, and their marks on the land would last for centuries. These settlements were more than just a place to rest and regroup after raids. They were the beginning of a new chapter for the Vikings in Britain, one where they would put down roots, build families, and leave an indelible imprint on the landscape, the culture, and the very fabric of the land itself. The Vikings, having once come as conquerors and raiders, now arrived as settlers with a different purpose. The fertile lands of the northeast, particularly in areas like Northumbria, East Anglia, and the regions surrounding the Humber, provided ideal places for the Norsemen to build their new homes. It wasn't simply about finding a place to live. It was about creating a new life. The Viking settlers brought with them a deep knowledge of farming and craftsmanship, of shipbuilding and trade, all of which they began to apply to the land they now called their own. They were not just invaders, They were builders, creators, and innovators. The villages they founded in these regions were often located near waterways, which allowed them to maintain their connection to the sea, the lifeblood of Viking society. Rivers and streams wound their way through the land, just as they had done for centuries, but now these waterways were being shaped by the presence of Viking settlements. The long ships, those magnificent vessels that had once carried Viking warriors into battle, were now used to transport goods, allowing the settlers to trade and communicate with the broader world. Trade routes were established, connecting the Viking settlements to other parts of Britain, and even beyond to Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. The land, once ravaged by raids, now hummed with the activity of daily life. The settlements themselves were often made up of sturdy longhouses, built from timber and thatch, designed to withstand the harsh weather of northern Britain. These longhouses were far from simple dwellings. They were communal spaces where entire families and sometimes multiple generations lived under one roof. Inside, the warmth of the hearths cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. These longhouses were where Viking families would gather to eat, sleep, and share stories. And while the men might have been off farming the land or engaging in trade, the women played a crucial role in maintaining the home and weaving the intricate tapestries that would later adorn Viking halls. The Vikings' influence on the land didn't stop at the longhouses. Their mastery of agriculture and livestock brought new farming techniques to Britain. The soil of the north, rich with potential, was now being tilled with Viking precision. Sheep, cattle, and pigs, animals that had long been part of Viking life in the north, now roamed the fields of England. The Viking settlers understood how to farm in these often unforgiving conditions, and their expertise made the land more productive than it had been before. In this way, they transformed the very landscape, turning it from a battlefield into a place of growth and prosperity. But it wasn't just the practical side of Viking life that left its mark. The Vikings also brought with them their rich traditions and culture, and over time these elements began to blend with the Anglo-Saxon way of life. Language was one of the most enduring legacies of the Viking settlements. The Old Norse language of the Vikings began to intermingle with the Anglo-Saxon tongue, creating a hybrid dialect that would come to define the speech of the northern and eastern parts of England. Many words we take for granted today, words like law, sky, and anger, are direct descendants of Old Norse. The language, once the exclusive domain of the Vikings, gradually became a part of the everyday life of the Anglo-Saxons, particularly in the regions where Viking settlement was strongest. The names of places, too, tell the story of Viking settlement. In the north and east of England, towns and villages with names that end in by or thorp can still be found today. These are the remnants of the Viking presence, for these suffixes are of Norse origin. By means village, and thorp means farmstead, both indicative of the Viking way of organizing their settlements. Over time, these names became so ingrained in the local landscape that they were no longer seen as foreign. Rather, they were part of the fabric of England itself. Yet, while the Vikings had built their homes and their communities, the Anglo-Saxons had not forgotten the violence that had accompanied the Viking invasions. Even as the settlers began to intermarry and integrate, there remained a sense of tension in the air. Old rivalries, though less visible than they had been during the days of raiding, still simmered just beneath the surface. But this was the nature of life in Britain at the time, a constant cycle of change and adaptation. The land, once scarred by Viking violence, had now become a place where cultures could merge and evolve. The tensions that remained were only a small part of a much larger story, a story of survival, of growth, and of the merging of two peoples into one. As time passed, the Viking settlements continued to thrive. They became centers of trade, culture, and innovation, with markets bustling with goods from across the known world. Yet these settlements were never fully isolated from the rest of Britain. They were interconnected with the rest of the kingdom through trade, politics, and even shared conflicts. The Viking presence in Britain, particularly in the northern and eastern regions, had left a lasting legacy. one that would influence the course of British history for generations to come. The question remains, how would this lasting Viking presence continue to shape the future of Britain? Would the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings fully merge into one unified people? Or would their differences continue to carve the land into distinct regions, each with its own identity? The answers lay hidden in the years to come, as new chapters in the saga of England were written, page by page, by those who walked the land where the Vikings had once tread. As the Viking Age unfolded across Britain, the Norsemen, once seen only as fearsome raiders and warriors, began to leave an indelible mark, not just on the land but on the spiritual fabric of the islands as well. For many, the Vikings were enemies to the Christian faith that had been deeply rooted in Britain since the early centuries of the Common Era. And yet, as the years passed, something extraordinary began to unfold. An interaction between two worlds, both so vastly different, yet eventually drawn together by the tides of time, necessity, and in some cases, sheer curiosity. When the Vikings first arrived on the shores of Britain, their beliefs were firmly rooted in the old ways of their ancestors. The Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, were their protectors, guiding them through battles, ensuring their ships stayed afloat on stormy seas, and granting them strength in the face of adversity. These gods were not just figures in stories, they were the foundation of Viking life. Every raid, every settlement, every journey was conducted under the watchful eyes of these powerful deities. The Viking worldview was deeply intertwined with these gods, and their influence shaped everything the Vikings did. But this pagan faith, with its wild tales of epic battles between gods, giants, and men, was so very different from the quiet, contemplative Christianity that had already made its home in Britain. Christianity in Britain, by the time the Vikings arrived, was already well established. The monasteries and churches that dotted the landscape were more than just places of worship. They were centers of learning, of culture, and of power. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had long embraced Christianity, and the faith had seeped into the very bones of the land. The teachings of Christ, with their emphasis on peace, forgiveness, and the eternal soul, stood in stark contrast to the Viking ethos of strength, honor, and glory in battle. For the most part, the Vikings did not understand this religion, seeing it as foreign and weak compared to their own robust and warrior-like spirituality. Christianity's gentle message of turning the other cheek was foreign to a people who had built their identity on the battlefield and the honor of conquest. Yet, when the Vikings first began their raids on Britain, they were not particularly concerned with the religious landscape. They came to plunder, to take what they could, and to expand their reach. The monasteries, particularly those that were situated along the coasts, became prime targets. The monks, with their peaceful, contemplative lives, were no match for the fierce and determined raiders. It is said that the Viking assault on the Lindisfarne monastery in 793, one of the most iconic events in early Viking history, sent shockwaves through Britain. The attack was brutal. Books and sacred relics were burned, and the monks were either killed or taken as slaves. For many, this raid represented the harshest of Viking values, the destruction of Christian sanctuaries, the pillaging of holy places. But the story did not end with the pillage. Over time, something changed. The Viking raids, once a symbol of ruthless paganism, began to shift toward a more complex interaction with Christianity. As the Norsemen settled in Britain, particularly in the areas that came under Viking control, they began to encounter the Christian faith in a more direct and lasting way. Christian missionaries began to reach the Viking settlers, and through a series of gradual and often peaceful conversions, many of the Vikings began to accept Christianity, not just as a foreign religion, but as a new way of life. One key figure in this transformation was King Olaf Tryggvason, a Viking king who would come to play a significant role in the spread of Christianity among the Norse people. Though his influence was largely felt in Scandinavia, the ripple effects of his efforts were also felt in Britain, particularly in the Viking-controlled areas. Olaf's conversion to Christianity, followed by his strong push to baptize his people, inspired many to adopt the faith. Slowly, the Old Norse beliefs with their gods and legends began to blend with the teachings of Christ. But this blending was not always seamless. It wasn't just a simple matter of swapping one set of beliefs for another. The Viking settlers did not immediately abandon their old gods. Instead, their conversion to Christianity often came in stages, marked by a mixture of old and new practices. Viking Christians might still have honored Thor with a feast or looked to Odin in moments of personal crisis, but alongside these traditional beliefs, they began to incorporate Christian rituals into their lives. The two religions, while fundamentally different in their teachings, began to coexist in the hearts and minds of the Viking settlers. Christianity didn't just replace the old ways, it transformed them, merging with the Viking spirit in ways that would eventually become uniquely Norse. This religious fusion began to shape the Viking settlements in ways both visible and subtle. In the churches and monasteries that were built in Viking-controlled areas, Christian saints and symbols began to take on an almost Viking quality. Churches were often constructed with Viking craftsmanship, wooden carvings, intricate designs that recalled the pagan past. Saints were depicted not just as holy figures, but as warriors with armor and swords, reflecting the Viking respect for strength and valor. In many ways, Christianity was reinterpreted through the lens of the Viking warrior code. And yet, even as Christianity took root, old Viking traditions still held sway. The Viking understanding of the afterlife, for instance, was radically different from the Christian idea of heaven and hell. While the Christians believed in eternal life with God, the Vikings had their own vision of the afterlife, a place where warriors were honored and celebrated, a hall of Valhalla where they could feast and fight forever. For some Vikings, this was a difficult belief to give up entirely. But over time, as they blended Christianity with their own traditions, they began to see the Christian afterlife as a different kind of Valhalla, an eternal realm of peace, but one still filled with honor and reward for those who had lived virtuous lives. It was not an easy transition. The Vikings, ever proud and fiercely independent, had to reconcile their past with the present. But just as they had adapted to the land, to farming, and to settling into new communities, they began to adapt to Christianity. And while they never fully abandoned their old ways, the religious shift that began with Viking raids and later continued through settlements marked the beginning of a slow but steady cultural and spiritual transformation. As we look back on this story, one must wonder how much of the old ways were truly abandoned and how much of them simply adapted and survived in new forms. The Vikings, it seems, were a people capable of both destruction and creation, capable of embracing new faiths without entirely letting go of their past. How would their religious journey evolve as they integrated deeper into the Christian world? And what role would the faith play in the shaping of their future? The answers, like the legacy of the Vikings themselves, remain part of the unfolding story of Britain's history. The Vikings, once feared across Europe for their lightning-fast raids and relentless conquests, eventually began to fade from the British landscape. But while their terrifying presence on the shores of Britain might have lessened, their influence did not vanish so easily. The end of the Viking Age in Britain was not marked by a single event or a dramatic collapse. Rather, it was a slow transition, a series of changes and adjustments that reshaped the course of history. Yet, in the centuries that followed, the legacy of the Vikings continued to echo through Britain, reverberating in ways that would alter the very fabric of its society. It's easy to imagine the Viking Age as a time of unbridled chaos, raiders attacking coastal monasteries, warriors settling in villages, and a constant state of flux. But eventually, the fierce warriors who once roamed the land began to change. The days of violent raids and merciless invasions gave way to an era of integration and settlement. The Viking chieftains who had once claimed the title of conquerors now found themselves part of a more complex world, where peace, trade, and political alliances became more important than the sword. As the Viking settlers began to blend with the Anglo-Saxon population, the Viking identity itself began to evolve, making their presence felt in more subtle ways. By the early 11th century, The political landscape of Britain was shifting. Viking rulers had come to control significant portions of land, particularly in the north and east lands that would eventually be known as the Danelaw. But even as they grew in power, they were no match for the unified kingdom of Wessex, led by kings like Aethelstan and Alfred the Great, who had fought so fiercely to preserve Anglo-Saxon control. The Vikings, despite their prowess and their hold on vast territories, began to find themselves increasingly drawn into the web of Anglo-Saxon politics. One of the final blows to the Viking hold on Britain came in 1016, when King Canute of Denmark, one of the most famous Viking rulers, became King of England after defeating King Edmund Ironside. Canute's reign marked the peak of Viking power in Britain. For a time it seemed as though the Viking dream of a northern empire had been realized. But even Canute, a man of immense power, could not defy the inevitable. After his death in 1035, the Viking Empire in Britain began to unravel. In the years that followed, the Anglo-Saxon nobility began to regain power, and Viking influence slowly faded from the political scene. Yet, even as the Viking political influence began to wane, their cultural and social legacy endured. The Viking settlers had not just left behind a trail of conquest and bloodshed, they had woven themselves into the fabric of British society. Their settlements became towns, and their ways of life blended with those of the Anglo-Saxons. In the countryside, Viking place names remain to this day. Cities like York, once a Viking stronghold, bear the marks of their settlers in their architecture, their language, and their traditions. Even in language, the Norse influence is evident. Many modern English words like sky, husband, and window are derived from Old Norse, a testament to the lasting impact of the Vikings on the English language. The Vikings also left their mark on British society through their art, their crafts, and their technology. The longboats, with their sleek, elegant designs, continued to inspire British shipbuilding for centuries. Viking metalwork, known for its intricate designs and durability, influenced Anglo-Saxon craftsmen. Even their legal system had an enduring effect. The Vikings had a sophisticated system of local governance, and many of the practices they used, like the Thing, a council where disputes were settled, found their way into British law. However, perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Vikings in Britain was their role in shaping the island's identity. By the time the last Viking raids had come to an end, the Viking presence in Britain had already become so intertwined with the Anglo-Saxon world that it was impossible to separate the two. The Vikings had not only left behind their blood and bones, they had also left behind their culture, their language, and their way of life. Over time, the distinctions between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings became less and less clear. The Vikings who once raided the shores of Britain now found themselves as part of the landscape itself. They were no longer a foreign presence, but a foundational part of what it meant to be British. And yet the Viking spirit, their fierce independence, their love of exploration, and their relentless drive lived on. The spirit of adventure, of boldly charting unknown waters, continued to echo through British history. Many of the qualities that defined the Vikings would come to define the British people themselves in the centuries that followed. The sense of national pride, the belief in the importance of strength and honor, the desire to conquer new frontiers, all of these would be passed down, not just through the generations that followed, but through the very essence of British identity. But as we look at the end of the Viking Age in Britain, we must also ask, what if the Vikings had never settled, never integrated so thoroughly into British society? Would the course of British history have been the same? What other influences might have shaped the island, and what other cultures might have left their imprint? The Vikings may have faded from the shores of Britain, but their legacy, both seen and unseen, continues to shape the world to this day. The echoes of their raids and settlements still ring out in the streets of Britain, in the language, the culture, and the very spirit of the people. Their influence, like the tides they once rode, may have ebbed away, but it will never truly be forgotten.